Welcome to the Eat, Train, Prosper podcast, where we provide you sustainable training principles for strength and building muscle, effective nutrition practices for improving and maintaining a lean physique, and practical lifestyle habits for becoming a champion of your own health, both inside and out. Hosted by Aaron Straker and Brian Borstein. Welcome back to another episode of the Eat, Train, Prosper podcast. Today we are talking about compound movements versus isolation movements. We often talk about topics with a view from above, zooming in immediately on the advanced trainee where we find ourselves now. But Brian, both you and I started somewhere, and the way in which we start can impact the way that we learn, the way that we interpret the information that we're receiving as a feedback from our body, and what processes basically become our guiding principles that got us to where we are currently with our nutrition and training journey. So that's going to be the topic for today. We're going to dive a little bit more into the beginning aspects, focusing more on the beginner and the advanced trainee. But before we get into this in depth, Brian, tell me about the last 7 days.
Last 7 days have been awesome. I finished up my deload week and began what I kind of referenced in the last episode was going to be the new 3 times a week full body program split into the AM PM sessions. So having, lower body in the morning and upper body in the evening, and then taking a day off and kind of doing that every other day, more or less. And I just finished my second session yesterday. Everything is good so far. Haven't really gotten sore too much. Got a little bit of soreness in my hamstrings. That's pretty standard for me. They get sore really easily. And the rest of the body seems to be recovering with that 1 day break. Mentally, it's exactly what I need in that I kind of found myself in the prior cycle, finishing workouts in the PM session and being like, oh, I can't believe I now have to go back tomorrow and hit the session in the AM and do another in the PM. And it just kind of felt like relentless. So this is really cool in that I know that I hit my 2 sessions in 1 day, which I actually enjoy. And then I have the reward of a day off, get to kind of focus on work and taking walks and doing some things like that. So overall, really excited about it. Only 2 days in, so can't speak to it from like a macro perspective yet. But I love this experimentation. So in your world, I know that you just posted a super dope transformation in the last 2 years, and obviously gained some size in your legs and shoulders. So tell us all about your week.
Yeah, my week's been good. I come in because like right now my goal is to put on weight, to put on muscle. Obviously what comes with that is a lot of eating, and it comes in waves where I'm just like, sometimes I get like a little bit over it, and I'm like, damn it, it's 8 p.m. I still need to get another meal in. I'm not really that hungry, but I know that like that's kind of what it takes. So this week has fortunately been one of the better weeks, and I found that uh, as crazy as it does seem, my weight I feel doesn't always linearly increase. Like it'll kind of be stagnant for a little bit, and then it'll jump like a pound and a half or something, and then kind of stay there. So that recently happened. I'm now sitting around the like mid 204 range. And then with that, I had, that post from yesterday. I was like, man, I wonder the last time I was this weight. I knew approximately around the time, but I was like, let me see if I have some of those old like logs. So I went back, found the exact date, and like sure enough, I had a progress photo from that exact date as well, because your photos on your phone have like geotag and date data. So it
Mhm.
was really really cool to see, because as kind of a little bit different than what we're going to talk about on today's episode. As an advanced training, like the margins get really small when you've been lifting and training for a very long time. And I've put on probably 97, 98% of the total amount of muscle mass that I realistically will in terms of like a sheer size standpoint. So you're just making these little micro improvements or being a little bit leaner at the same body weight. And it was just cool to see. It's been almost 2.5 years in between those two dates. And just seeing like the fruits of my labor over that almost 2.5 years in a direct comparison under identical scenarios, fasted first thing in the morning at the exact body weight. So that was really cool.
So did like I can't actually remember a time in that period from 2018 to now where you did like a dedicated cutting phase. So have you literally been like on the pursuit of growth for like 2 straight years?
Kind of the I never so So that really changed a lot for me. So that 2018 is when I lost, I went down from 227 to 195. And that's when I got like really lean for the first time ever since, I was like an adult and not like a, skin and bones type kid growing up. And from there, it was really wild. Just like I really, really perfected my nutrition practices and really kind of honed in on my real philosophy with nutrition coaching and my beliefs and stuff around things there. And it was really wild to, once I kind of established that, getting outside those confines was pretty hard to do. I had to like, really fall off the wagon per se, which is something that just doesn't happen with me, or really kind of push like a lot of really high carbohydrate or really high fat for like a consistent time. I would always kind of zoom back to that, 195 area. And I never really had to. Like I did some mini cuts for like if I had like a photo shoot I wanted to do or something. And that was like a 2.5, maybe 3 week endeavor. And that is always kind of a reprieve just from eating all the time, and seeing what new kind of strategies I can learn because I'm always experimenting on myself. And but yeah, it was like I never really had to like diet in that time, or was always trying to like basically stay at maintenance. Something else that's really important to put into consideration is with our lifestyle, we're moving countries and cities every 3 to 5 months. It takes its toll on you. Like when you set up in a new country and you're like, okay, where's the grocery store? And then like you're like, oh, we don't have these creature comfort type things. You need to find these new foods, play their routine just to get back up to operating capacity of where you were before. And that sometimes takes like 2 or 3 weeks, and then that's your weight will drop a little bit or different things change. So it's been somewhat inconsistent, I would say. But yeah, I haven't been like super super hard pushing, just because of like the time and spent in a single place and things like that.
Gotcha. Yeah, it's interesting though. Just, you've definitely had like a linear path of gaining. And I think that you haven't even gained like a ton of fat in that process either. I mean, even looking at those pictures, like you look leaner. So it's cool that to be able to see that too.
And that was one of the main goals of this effort. Like in the past, I've put on a bunch of weight, before and got bigger, but I've always like accumulated like a hefty, not a hefty, but like an appreciable amount of fat. But my specific goal with this time is like I want to learn how to grow lean for the first time. I'm okay with it taking, a year as opposed to like 4 or 6 months or whatever, but I want to learn something new. I want to challenge my own thoughts or challenge what I know to be true about things. And it's been cool actually seeing it come to fruition.
Yeah, very cool. I'm taking a slow gain approach this time too for the first time. And since I ended my last cut at like 185, I basically took like a week or two and didn't really think about it and just kind of ate. And then I ended up at like 189, and it's now been 16 or 17 weeks since that point. And I just was 194 this morning. So I've gained like 5 pounds in 16 weeks, which is like, a third of a pound a week or something like that. Literally the slowest I've ever done this. And I think that it's a much more higher quality experience in general.
Yeah, that's it's not the really sidetracker conversation for today, but that is one of the like biggest in terms of like hypertrophy and gaining kind of methodologies that I've found in recent years is when you really try and like put the hammer down on hypertrophy and gaining weight, you really just get fat faster. And eventually you're going to have to just turn around and diet that off. So assuming you're of age, you're grown, you're 25, 26 or whatever, and you've been training for a while. Let's say you are at that late intermediate to advanced stage. Taking the slow approach is generally going to be better in the long term for, all things considered.
Yep, totally agree.
Cool. Let's get into today's topic. So, do you want to kind of? I know I give a brief introduction when we started the podcast, but you want to give a little bit more of where we're going to start at?
Yeah, totally. So we're basically going to talk you guys through compound and isolation movements, discuss some of the basic training concepts that have been part of our journey and how we started, as far as like the ratio of compounds to isolations, etc. Um, and potentially moving into how you would eventually implement isolations most effectively and how you might progress them. And, we can use anecdote here to talk about how we did things in the past and if now kind of looking back on it, if we would change anything going forward.
Yeah, I think one thing to kind of start at is kind of starting with a little bit of anecdote with myself. I was very fortunate that when I started lifting, it was for playing football. So we had coaches in the weight room that were like, we had, structured programming that were guiding us. And just by nature of you have, 30 kids or whatever, for equipment, it's much easier to put in like squat racks as opposed to like, three leg presses or a hack squat or something like that. In terms of like, and the whole goal, right, of us lifting was for us to get bigger for football, for improving sport performance. So I think, and I think that's generally how a lot of people will find the weight room in those younger ages is through like sport performance. So by that, it kind of leads you into that compound setup kind of first. What is your kind of experience with when you were younger in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely started primarily with compound movements too, which I want to discuss, a little more in detail here. But I want to start as well with a little bit of kind of anecdote over the years as someone who's been in the gym and owned a gym. And um, maybe this is filled with a little bit of bias too, but, you know, throughout the years, you see people come and go through the gym, especially when you've been part of a gym, the same gym for a number of years. And you always can kind of tell when people walk in if the first thing that they do is go over to like the dumbbell curl rack and they do some cable push downs and then they go to like a leg extension machine and a leg curl machine, and these are like the things that they're doing of choice upon entering the gym, you just kind of know inherently that these people probably aren't going to end up with as much success as the person that comes into the gym the first time. And you see them in a squat rack or learning how to deadlift, paying attention to their form, really trying to get better at things that are very difficult. And I think that there's something to be said for that. And I would say that there is a correlation from what I have seen between those two different types of individuals and then kind of what you see in them, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years down the road.
I agree 100%. Something that what you're saying just kind of sparked a recurring thought I've been having recently. So it's, the beginning of the year, right, which means there's a large influx of people who are in the gym, right? So maybe not for the first time, but trying to engrave this habit, and something that kind of a little bit of maybe wisdom for some intermediates or advanced, or sorry, not advanced, beginners, is like when you're in that gym, like take a look around at the people in the gym, like look at the people who are doing like really just kind of outlandish things in the gym, and then ask yourself, like, do I want to look like that person? Do I think that that is like a good model to follow? And it's generally the guys who are just like doing bicep curls that with like the weight's way too heavy and they're like grunting and making all these like kind of ridiculous movements. But then like kind of like, okay, that's like an avatar in the gym. Scan to the person in the like squat rack, scan to the person doing like rows. Those people who are doing those more like foundational type things are generally going to have, they're going to be stronger, a well-built physique. They kind of know their way around, and that's because they have primarily spent the majority of their time doing those things, not the like, the final 5% type stuff. So it's something that like a lot of, it can be, if you're new, you can kind of fall by either wayside, but there's definitely a wayside that you want to fall on, which is going to be focusing primarily on the compounds, at least at the very beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's just hard. Like when you're in the gym, inherently we should know that you're in the gym and it's not easy, that you have to put in work. It's called a workout. And so seeing someone going through and doing fluffy movements in their early stages, not getting close to failure, and literally the weight is being so light that you don't even have to brace like through your midline. You're just like kind of blah, blah, just it's literally like doing like pool aerobics or something like that, but with a cable machine. And you just know. I mean, you just know. So I think that that's kind of idea number one is just that hard work is required. And the thing with compound movements is that they're hard and they're functional. So they emulate movements that we might do in daily life. There's never a moment that you're going to pick up like something from here that has a cable on it and you're going to have to like pull down and use your triceps, right? And bicep curls, like very rarely are you going to pick something up in such a manner that it's your bicep that's taking that load. In reality, you're going to bend down and you're going to pick it up, and then you're probably going to do some sort of clean based hip movement to get whatever you're trying to get up to your shoulder. You're not actually going to stand there and curl it. So learning how to use your body as a unit and understanding the power that can be generated through hip extension and through these other functional movement patterns like sitting down and standing back up are all really important things to have. Picking up a suitcase in an airplane and putting it in an overhead compartment, like nobody curls that and then upright rows it and then overhead presses it, right? We use our full body to pick that thing up. So I think that's important to keep in mind. What do you say?
Yeah, something that I think I kind of took for granted like early on that is become like more apparent in recent years is what the compounds teach you like body awareness and how the different muscular systems of your body are tied together. So like things like core stability, right? So being able to like brace your core and your lower back when you're moving through like a hinging position or something like that. If you kind of just jumped into the gym and just going like maybe straight hypertrophy or straight um, like isometric type movements, like you never learn how these kind of systems are tied together, and you might not learn like proper bracing or these things that then have carryover when you're doing um, more isolation stuff. So like a really good example is like when you're uh, kind of an example that you kind of brought up, so like a tricep press down, right? So as you get to a point where you're stronger and you can use more load, like you need to brace your core, you need to kind of set your hips so that the machine isn't like pulling you forward or whatever, and you can kind of lock your body into the position using like your core, your stance to brace yourself so that you can then just work that tricep. But if I had never been through like squatting and overhead pressing, these different movements that require that, me building that core strength and be able to brace my body in that manner, I would that thing would be pulling me all over. I'd have movement at my hip, movement at my shoulder, and then I wouldn't really get as much out of that tricep anyway. So the carryover from the compounds is so important because it just teaches you like pro what's that word, proprioception, do you know how to say that?
Proprioception.
um,
Yeah,
and just how to brace at different movements.
totally. 100% agree. I think it would be prudent for us to define beginner, intermediate, and advanced. And kind of the most common way that I've seen this done in the evidence based space is to use rate of progression as kind of the designator. So somebody who is advanced like us, we may not increase load on a movement really in an entire mesocycle, macro cycle. It might be 3 months, 6 months before we even see any progress at all. Like we just grind and grind, and then one day adaptations catch up, and we are like, "Oh my god, I got an extra rep! This is amazing." Um, Someone who's an intermediate should be able to see some progress monthly or every mesocycle. So if a mesocycle is like 4 to 6 weeks, you would expect that mesocycle to mesocycle, you should be able to use more weight than you did the prior weight for the similar number of reps. And someone who's a beginner, which is usually anywhere from about 6 months to 18 months, kind of depending on the person and the commitment level, et cetera, et cetera. Um, you should be able to see progress weekly. That doesn't mean you have to be able to slap 5 pounds on the bar, because realistically, if you added 5 pounds to the bar every week for 52 weeks, that would be 260 pounds. That's not real, so that doesn't happen. But you should be able to see progress each time you go in the gym. Maybe you get an extra rep, something along those lines. And it's the best part of training because you literally go to the gym and you see results. Like you get excited to go to the gym because you're like, I did this last week and now my adaptations are happening so quickly that I know that I can get an extra rep. It's not like, oh man, I really hope that like I've optimized my sleep and my nutrition and that my stress isn't too high and all these things, and maybe if I'm lucky I'll get an extra rep today. It's like wah wah. So beginner's the best. Like you have the best of all worlds. You get to make progress all the time. Every time you look in the mirror, it looks like you have a new muscle or a new vein or something like that. So being a beginner is the best. And to take advantage of these beginner gains, the best way to do this is to use movements that allow you to use a high level of loading so that when you do increase weight, it's a less percentage of the total, right? So if I'm trying to increase a bicep curl and I'm going from a 10-pound dumbbell to a 15-pound dumbbell, that's way too big of an increase, a 50% increase. Even going from a 20 to a 25-pound dumbbell, 25% increase, right? If you're deadlifting and you're a noob deadlifting, you can probably deadlift 185 or 200 or 225 or something like that. So if you're adding 5 pounds to the bar, we're looking at like 2% increase. That's a very reasonable increase. In fact, some studies have shown that the body has difficulty detecting any increase less than 1%. So, there's a good testament for fractional loading as a tangent. But, if you can just if you can use lifts that have a high loading capacity and allow you to then increase either a rep or a load and have it be a smaller percentage of the total, then you're setting yourself up for success, both in your enjoyment of the process as well as the results that you get from it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all of that. One thing I did want to kind of back up a little bit and recover quickly with like the beginner, the intermediate, the advanced is with moving through those progressions, something that now this is a little bit different because I'm obviously like a nutritionist, so I'm going to kind of look at it from that angle. But this is something that I feel like really doesn't get enough light shed on it, especially when I'll kind of talk with people around like research studies that were done on things. It's assuming that your eating and your lifestyle practices are in support of these adaptations. So let's say you're that high school sophomore or something like that who's a beginner trying to increase your weights. Like if you're not eating anything or you're not eating at least at a range to support like maintaining your body weight, those adaptations are going to be slower. Let's say you're in college now, right? And you are same thing, a beginner kind of starting. If you're drinking like literally 5, 6 days a week and you sleep from 2 a.m. to like 6 a.m. every night, it is dramatically going to negatively impact the rate at which you will progress. So you can take that same person, same effort in the gym, same time in the gym, and just kind of make sure they eat at least enough. Not even talking about the quality of your calories, literally just volume and quantity, and have them sleep like 20 or 30% more. Let's say they go from like 4 hours to 6 hours, which is still pretty poor, being completely honest. Like the amount of progress you can make can be night and day. So I want to that's just kind of make sure that that is covered because it's something that doesn't get talked enough about, especially when things are, they monitor rates of growth or rates of hypertrophy, and then I'll be like, well, was nutrition considered in this? And they're like, no, we didn't pay attention to nutrition. And I'm like, it's a pretty big thing not to pay attention to, because if you're not feeding someone and then person two's in a 20% surplus, the amount of hypertrophy you're going to get is like drastically different. um, so it's just something to make sure you're taking into consideration.
I am really glad you shared that. And I actually have a personal anecdote that exemplifies exactly what you're saying. And that when I first started training in high school, the impetus for why I started training was twofold. It was to get better at sports, but it was also because I got in a fight with this kid in ninth grade, and he called me a Pillsbury Doughboy, which I was 5'2" and 130 pounds. So I wasn't like, I mean, I wasn't fat, but I was 5'2" and I was 130 pounds. So, I was a little soft. So my inclination was always to want to be leaner. That was kind of my impetus for training to begin with. Um, and so throughout high school, I was playing basketball, 2 hours a day. It was my main sport. It was why I was training. And then on top of that, I was curating my nutrition such that I was trying to really focus on, 6 meals a day, lean proteins, low fat, all the things that would kind of be conducive to getting lean. And so it could be a number of factors, a confluence of factors, but I didn't gain a ton in high school. I went from 5'2" at 130 to 5'10" at 170 when I graduated. And so 5'10" at 170 with some muscle after, 3 years of training is relatively skinny. And so I never gained a lot of strength. Like I've even talked to you about how, you referenced 225 bench as like the thing when you graduate high school. I didn't even get close to that. I would say like 135 was heavy for me. Um, and this was all kind of because I tried to remain lean too much, right? And then I got to college. And here's what happened freshman year of college. The very first weekend, I was in a girl's dorm after hours and got written up, got a ticket, got an under alcohol drinking violation,
Wait, the
and
first
I was
weekend of college?
a second weekend, something like that. Yeah, yeah. So I yeah, basically I started. I was worried about myself. My parents made me feel bad about it. You're really fucking up, all these things. So I more or less stopped drinking for the first 6 to 8 months of college, and just ate food and trained. That was like my life. I ate so much cafeteria food, all of the like fried chicken sandwiches that were there, um, and just lifted weights like 6 days a week. And I put on 30 pounds, definitely not all muscle, but 30 pounds, and I finally benched over 225 for reps for the first time, and that literally happened in like a 6 to 8 month period. So it does goes to show it's a testament to your point, and I do think that optimizing those variables is important when you talk about these progression
It
rates.
really is. And what's really interesting is we have basically kind of almost like polar opposite stories. So I grew up like skin and bones. Like I played a bunch of different sports. I was really tall early on and I was literally bones. So when I went into high school, I was 5'9", 130 pounds. So I mean that's like it's like creepy skinny if you actually think about that. And then obviously got it like was playing football. And then what really changed is my sophomore year they moved me to tight end. And what that means is like you're now hanging out with all the linemen. So, for me being super tall and really skinny, and then everyone is so much like weighs so much more than me. So they're so much stronger than me. I needed to start eating a lot. So I would just eat everything. And when you're hanging out with the linemen, obviously the linemen can eat. So, I mean, I put on 30 pounds a year in high school. So that, I mean, it's just, and not all of it, nowhere near all of it was like lean body mass. Probably by the time I was a junior, I was up to like 20% body fat. And then that would kind of drop down through football season because you're not lifting as much and you're just doing so much conditioning and so much sport. But still, when you're just eating so much and putting on weight at that rate, it's like perfect for those strength adaptations. And it wasn't until like kind of then when I was in like college, I'm like, well, I don't need all this football weight anymore. I'm not playing like football. So I finally kind of like roped my eating habits in a little bit. But obviously alcohol kind of just, completely takes that out of the water. But yeah, it was really interesting. Like my eating hit super hard, super fast in high school. I put on a bunch of weight. And then really I've been more or less, within those ranges of weights ever since I've been 17.
Yeah, it's very interesting. We both have stories of kind of ballooning up our weight and then almost like recomping at a body weight once we kind of stabilize.
Mm-hmm.
Like mine was kind of 200 right after that freshman year binge period. I was 200 pounds, but I was like a pretty soft 200 because I went from 170 to 200 basically overnight. And then I spent the next like 15 years just like hanging out at above or below 200 and just refining it and making it better. And kind of cool that that's like, what it's been. So, as we kind of continue the conversation of compounds and isolations, I think one really important thing to state that probably most people are aware of, but the compounds are compounds because they work multiple muscle groups, right? A bicep curl pretty much just works your bicep and then like some forearm extensors, etc. But when you look at a movement like a squat, you're getting your quads, your a little bit of hamstrings, glutes, hips, erectors, etc. When you're doing a bench press, you're getting anterior delts, pecs, triceps, even a little bit of lats maybe. So you're getting a lot of different muscle groups in one lift. Some studies have even shown that when you're doing like a bench press, and we mentioned this on our last episode in the overhead press, that the triceps are actually significant contributors. So, when you're a beginner and you're just getting into the gym for the first year or two, any stimulus is a new stimulus. Your triceps will grow from bench pressing and from overhead pressing. Your biceps will grow from doing pull ups and doing rows and things like that. When you squat, your glutes will grow, your quads will grow. You might even get some calf growth because you just haven't put your calves under that type of load before. When you deadlift, you're going to get your whole posterior chain, your erectors, your traps, all of these things we don't need to isolate. I mean, even looking down the road at where I am now, like I still don't do trap work or forearm work because these moves are these muscles are hit more than enough through like the compound movements that I use for my shoulders and for my biceps. So the same thing kind of can be backed down and thought of in the beginner stage and realize that, you know, you're a beginner, so you're going to get results from almost anything you do. B, your time is valuable. If you're a beginner, you're probably got other life priorities. Like you're not at a point in your life yet where fitness is life. So you have things that are way more important to you. You want to get the most bang for your buck. That is why we focus on these compound movements, right?
Yeah, I mean that's such a big part of it. It's you just get for your resources in terms of time and energy, it's going to apply over a much more, broad application of your physique and what you're working. So I mean something like a like the forum was a really good example, right? Unless you're getting like deep into bodybuilding or whatever, like training your forearms is kind of, you're going to get enough just through like gripping and in your various pulling movements. So something like a row, right, is just going to give you so much more, as opposed to like some, kind of thing of like a rear delt type thing with like a forearm, movement. It's just you're getting, maybe not complete direct work, but ancillary just through the movements of, the heavier compound. So it was a really good point to bring up.
Cool. Yeah, so I have 7 movements that I think are the basic movement patterns that somebody that's a beginner should focus on. And for me, in my perspective, that is a squat movement pattern. It could be, it probably will be a back squat, but it could be a front squat or, I wouldn't even be like super opposed if someone were to use like a leg press or a hack squat machine, but I would prefer like a free weight for someone just starting out here. Some sort of deadlift or hip hinge movement, like a RDL, stiff legged deadlift, regular deadlift. Again, I think a standard deadlift teaches you the different aspects of hip hinging that you probably need to understand initially, in that the chest or torso rises at the same time as the hips, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that that will carry over to other movement patterns. Then we have a bench press variation. I've discussed how I don't really like the barbell before. So I think a dumbbell would be fine there too. Again, barbell being the most basic. A row, again, barbell or dumbbell, barbell being more basic for sure. Some sort of dip or weighted push up variation, a pull up or assisted pull up of some sort, and an overhead press. And so we have those 7 movement patterns. 2 that essentially would be considered back movements, one chest, one shoulder, and then a leg and a deadlift would just be, call it all of the posterior chain. What do you think about those 7?
Yeah, when I was, as you read through them, I'm thinking back to like my early years, and I mean, this made up the overwhelming majority of our training. I mean, we did dips every single day, which is like, kind of strange that they made us do that, but um,
Yeah.
we did. And I mean, we would do some, like, we would have a little bit of bicep work. And I remember we would do a lot of like the 21s with the easy bar curl. And that was basically about it. We would do for biceps. And then we would do some tricep work, like some overhead, maybe once a week. But again, we were doing dips every single day, so our triceps were getting smashed. And we squatted 3 days a week, And I think the one thing I will say is we didn't start deadlifting until, I want to say, maybe my junior year, and I think that's a little bit different where you enter with age and stuff, because you get high school kids, right? And you teach them the deadlift, they're just going to like shoot their spines out of their back, because telling someone like, okay, you need to like set your hips and you pull, no, everyone's just going to like jerk off the ground, which is exactly what we did. So I think the squat and the deadlift are interesting in that they require such like a technical understanding to perform well. And it's one of those things like, this isn't something you're going to teach or learn really well in like 2 months. You know what I mean? Like, I'm sure everyone's kind of like, I remember personally, like when we were first squatting, especially when you're like maybe young and you're kind of lanky and you don't have that good body awareness, you look like a baby giraffe squatting. Like, you don't understand, like, okay, your ankles stay like over your ankles, and your foot placement is here. You have no idea how your hips and stuff work with like creating force. And when you're young, you're still super flexible, right? So you can squat with this like super wide stance and still hit depth, but you're like completely out of your like leverage positions and stuff. So I think it's some of those, they're just harder, to learn well, when you're younger. But these are perfect for an overwhelming majority of your training, because you're going to get basically the entire body, and you learn how to like brace. You learn body awareness, which are a lot of these things that, if you weren't doing these things, would take so much longer to learn without them, in my opinion.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I actually think the point about, the squat and specifically the deadlift being kind of difficult to learn and the whole baby giraffe analogy. And I got into a discussion with a guy who was kind of a mentor of mine years ago, Paul Carter. He's a face on the internet at Lift Run Bang on the gram. He was kind of a mini mentor of mine in the late '90s when I began training, and he actually has a new perspective on this because when we first started chatting in the late '90s, his statement to me was literally get to 200, 300, 400, 500 on overhead press, bench press, squat, and deadlift, and then come back and talk to me. That was his statement. And he's kind of changed his tune a little bit. And I had a recent discussion with him about this. So I want to get into that in a minute. But first, I think that I want to touch on just the diagnostic tool of of training in general, of compound movements, of isolation movements, and kind of using an analogy here. I came up with this, and I don't know if it's a good one or not, but we're gonna do our best here.
Yeah, let's fire
So
off.
so we're building a house, right? We have a house. It's just me and my wife. We don't need a lot. We just have a house, and we're gonna build the base. We're gonna build the support structure, the walls, the electrical. All the things are gonna go in, and that's kind of us just putting in the basics, the big compound movements, doing what we need to do to build our house, adding a roof, all these things, right? But then the years go by, and we're like, ooh, I kind of want this back deck now. Maybe we're going to add a screen around this back deck. And then a few years later, now we have like 3 kids and we need to add an addition to the house. We need an extra bedroom. We're like, oh my God, what happened now? So now these kids and this addition and all these different things we're adding on are sort of the isolation movements. But if we just moved into this house initially and it had all of these amazing things already, but it was just the two of us, it would be way too much. We wouldn't need all of that. We would get lost in our own house. So over the course of time, out of necessity, we're adding these things. So how was that analogy? Did that work?
Yeah, I think it was really good because it talks about building your foundation, right? So if you are like new to start lifting, right, and all you're doing is arms because you're like, oh, girls, care about arms. Side note: girls don't care about shit when it comes to your physique. Only other dudes do. um, but you might have arms, but everything else is built on like a poor foundation. And I mean, this will eventually lead to probably like higher incident rates of injury, or really just you end up with these very strange what's the word I'm looking for, imbalances with your physique. And I'm sure we might be able to speak a little bit to that because you and I both have some kind of weird imbalances that we've created over the years, through our different training, basically preferences and sports we've gotten into too. I think we'll get into that. But yeah, I mean, if you want a strong foundation so that you don't have to worry about problems with it down the line.
Yeah. And then on kind of the notion of diagnostics, in that, if you just focus on these compound movements and you watch your whole body grow, like when you say someone was forward thinking enough that before they even started training they were like, I know 20 years from now I'm still going to be training, I want to have measurements from the beginning. Okay, let's just take this avatar out there. This person wasn't training at all. They took measurements of their arms, their biceps, their waist, their back, their chest, their thighs, all these different things, and then all they did was compound movements. They could literally watch these muscle groups grow. The arms would grow, the shoulders would grow, the chest would grow, all these things would grow without ever actually having to specialize on it. And if you did that, then you would actually be able to assess in almost real time, like in a matter of a month or two, whether the compound movements that you're doing are still working for you or not, right? Just straight up like, okay, my arm was 15 3/4 inches and I haven't done a single set for arms. I'm still just doing pull-ups and rows. And now 3 months later, my arm is 16 1/4 inch. Okay, well, why the fuck would you go add in isolation movements when your arms are growing just fine doing what you're doing? So if you have this data and you know that you're growing just fine the way it is, then you can put off having to put that addition on your house until you actually need it, right? Why put the addition on when you don't actually have the third kid yet, right? So then you have the third kid, you add the addition, you're like, shit, we actually need it now. So these things are happening out of necessity. We're adding in curls because our arms stopped growing. We're adding in curls because our pull downs and our rows stopped progressing, right? These are the things. So we're adding these isolation movements out of need, not out of desire or because we want an arm pump or some stupid shit like that. Um, and the same thing that you and I have found, as you alluded to, in that the imbalances that we created, it's not that we neglected training legs necessarily. We just didn't know that we needed to do leg extensions and leg curls in a high quantity to make sure that we were balancing all of the work that we were doing for the with the deadlifts and the squats and all the different compound movements. But as soon as we added these movements in, we both saw our legs blow up. I mean, that picture that you have that we just talked about in the beginning of the episode is a testament to what 2 years of adding in isolation movements to your legs can do. But imagine if you were just starting out and you did squats and deadlifts and leg extensions and leg curls and calf raises, and you did leg curls seated, and you did them lying, and you did leg extensions single leg with a pause, and you did pre-exhaust, and you incorporated all of these things all at once, and then you're like, oh fuck, I'm not making progress anymore. What do I do now?
Yeah, it's just like you're increasing the complexity much sooner than you need to. And then one, you don't know where to go from there because it's not like a straightforward linear thing because you're already doing everything. And yeah, it's just, unnecessary early complication. The one thing I will say that I think, will be really important to kind of talk about there is with the sport and what we were doing, right? So it's kind of how we've gone through progression or whatever, and different people with your different anatomies will receive, I don't want to say like different rates of progress, but it really is different rates of progress. But if you're someone who's like a shorter person with a short femur, like when you squat and in the bottom of your squat, if you have that quality ankle dorsiflexion and your knees out over your toe, like you can get in a really good position to grow your quads like really really well from that, and a lot of people do. And then there's people like us who are have very long femur, and it's just you're not in a as advantageous position at that same depth because of your physical structure. And that was something that took me a very long time to understand.
Yeah, for sure. I encourage everyone to go back and check out the prior episode we did on movement execution, because we spent a ton of time talking about ankle dorsiflexion and getting your knees out over your toes and quad stimulus and all that stuff. Um, and also in sport performance too. I think this is a point that we may have sort of missed in the beginning, in that you and I both started training for sport. So the training that we were doing was meant to improve our sport performance. If you take somebody and you put them into even like a hack squat machine as their first like introduction to squatting, yes, you're squatting. It's probably going to be better than not squatting, but you're really leaving a lot of like the stability side and the strength throughout the entire chain. You're leaving that on the table by immediately going into a squat with a back support. So just some food for thought in that. Do you have anything to add before I move on here?
No, let's keep it going.
Cool. So I referenced Paul Carter before. Paul is the guy that was my mentor. He told me to get really, really strong on the big lifts and then come back and talk to him. So that's basically what I did. In those conversations we had in the late 90s, I was kind of like, okay, I got to get strong, and that was right before the time where I went to college, stopped drinking, and actually got really strong. So then, over the years, he and I have kind of continued communicating off and on, not a whole ton, but enough. And recently, we had an in-depth conversation over DM where it actually happened because I tagged him in a post where I talked about how important it is to get really strong on the big movements first. And he responded and was like, actually, that's not how I feel about this anymore. Um, so Paul brought up an analogy, and I think that there is some applicability here, but I do have a bit of a retort to it as well. So what Paul said was that he kind of aligned with what Aaron was saying about the complexity of the movements in the squat and the deadlift and some of the other compound movements, and how for beginners having to learn to stabilize a barbell and learn how to properly hip hinge, even to activate your chest when you're bench pressing. I mean, that's a skill that takes years and years. So he was saying that if you had two twins and one of them was training with big lifts and the other twin was training in a more muscle specific, like hypertrophy focused pattern, and the goal was, let me get you to 20 pounds of muscle as quickly as possible, he is very confident that the person that took the more hypertrophy muscle specific approach would get there faster than the person that's doing the complex big lifts. And I actually agree to a point. I think that if you were somebody and you knew from day one, before you even picked up a weight, and you were like, I want to be massive, I want to stand on the bodybuilding stage in underwear, and I want to flex, and I want everybody's jaws to drop, and I don't care about sport performance, and this is just exactly the pursuit that I want, then Paul is probably right. There would be enough of a learning curve in learning how to do the barbell basic movements that it would be a number of months before the person was even beginning to stimulate muscle, and not just creating neural adaptations to trying to understand and learn the movements to do them properly to stimulate the proper muscles. Whereas the person that you just lock into a machine or into a cable and you literally guide their muscles through the movement pattern, like Paul is suggesting, if the goal is to get to 20 pounds as quickly as possible, and we know that in the first year of training, you can probably gain 20 pounds of muscle your first year if you do everything right, he's probably right. Here's kind of my counter argument to this, though. Most people don't know that hypertrophy is what they want right off the bat. It's kind of ridiculous to assume that the direction that someone takes their training isn't going to be some sort of like meandering journey across many different strength pursuits, right? Like you can even look at my journey where I started in like this more sport specific, I want to get strong, get more in shape for basketball, and then I went to college and I did a bro split and I just wanted to be jacked, and then I found CrossFit and I really wanted to perform well at CrossFit, and I got into Olympic lifting and powerlifting, and then I came out the other side and I'm back into hypertrophy, now 20 plus years in. So I don't think that Paul's example is realistic for most people, and nor do I even think that it would be like a good idea for you to just immediately off the bat say that hypertrophy is your chosen one, right? Um, so I think it's important for you to go out and play the scene a little bit, meet a few different girls. Don't just settle for the first one. It might work out. Maybe hypertrophy is your girl, and that's the thing. But maybe it's not, and maybe you'll have years of regret or resentment for being locked into this one pursuit dogmatically and not allowing yourself to kind of play the field a little bit. What do you think?
Yeah, the thing that I like that you said there was dogmatically. So deciding something for a dogmatic reason, not really knowing if it is truly what you want, because simply for the fact that you haven't tried the other things. And I think with the context of this conversation, because we're talking about beginner, because we're talking about the beginner stage moving into an intermediate, a lot of people might not even really know the difference. So obviously using myself as an example, back when I started lifting, we were doing powerlifting, literally single ply powerlifting. We competed. I thought that that's what every high school football player in America did. Oh, we're just lifting. You go to these lifting competitions, you put on a squat suit. That's because all the other kids in the schools we played were there too. I thought that everyone did this. Then as I got into college and realized that's not the case whatsoever, we were in this very niche thing of like just 4A schools in Pennsylvania where it was like that was culture. And a lot of kids, like they encouraged you, to play other sports and play baseball in the spring and play basketball. Whereas our school, our football coach was like, in our ear, quit basketball, quit track. We want you in the weight room so we can be better at football. So I think it's really like you don't have this. It's like hindsight is 2020, right? And a lot of people don't know that like maybe you want to go into pure hypertrophy or something like that, and kind of playing that field and seeing what your interests are, what will kind of motivate you will be a little bit different. And I think you will go through different phases in your life as well. My progression was very similar to you. I started basically in powerlifting. And then when I got to college, I just moved into like your bro splits because I liked lifting. I burned out on that, found CrossFit, and I, kind of squeezed everything I could get out of that until I ran myself into the ground. And I reached my upper echelon there. I competed at regionals. I didn't have any more goals. I went into Olympic weightlifting, did that for a while, really enjoyed it. Then, went into powerlifting again for a little bit. And now I'm back at like hypertrophy training. So you will move through these different kind of phases. And I think that's good. It's fun to kind of transition your focus a little bit, because at some point you will kind of, no, I don't want to say run out of steam on ones, but to get to that next level, maybe you're not willing to commit to that, those requirements or whatever. Maybe it's a hobby for you, and you get to a point where, like, let's say you're powerlifting and it's a hobby, and you're like, man, I feel like garbage, and I'm, not, maybe you're not kind of happy with you look because you've been chasing the numbers. You've let your weight slide up in chase of those numbers, and you realize maybe you've reached a point where it's not worth that next level. Same thing with CrossFit or Olympic weightlifting or maybe hypertrophy, like a bodybuilding. You're like, well, I'm not going to get on stage, so maybe I want to try this other thing. And I think you don't find your sweet spot until you at least go through a few, and that's normal for the majority of people. Now, some people definitely, when they're young, they hit it and they know exactly what they want, and those are generally your greats.
Dude, that's such a good point too. I feel like the statement about, maybe hypertrophy is just, maybe you're just like you don't have the time or the place to really work to excel at it. But the thing being that like you can probably get 90 to 95% of your hypertrophy gains ever without even having to do an isolation movement. Like you can just do those 7 movements that I listed above and get to 90-ish percent. Like if you get to a point where you're dipping 3 or 4 plates for reps and you're squatting 365 for sets of 5 or 10 or something like that, like your legs are going to be big. I don't know that you're going to get much more than 5% by adding in some leg extensions and some leg curls, right? So there does kind of reach this point where you're approaching the intermediate stage and you have a decision to make, right? Like, do you want to take the time to add in these isolation movements? Like maybe your recovery capacity can handle it, but maybe there's other priorities in life, right?
Yeah, that's a really, really important consideration to make. And I think that's going to be, very different person to person. If you're just someone who wants to be, healthy, right? And okay, I want to age well. Bone density is important to me. Keeping my blood sugars in a good place is important to me. And I want to be strong, as like from like a father figure, or whatever. Like I want my kids to watch me being healthy and taking care of myself. Maybe it's like a family type, like commitment goal sort of thing. Like, yeah, you put together a garage gym, you get yourself the basics, and maybe you work 2 jobs and you're super busy and you just don't have the time to go to like a gym and give it an hour every day, including the commute and the drive back, and you got 30-35 minutes, and you can do that in the garage. Perfect.
Yep,
There's nothing wrong with that whatsoever.
I agree. So let's assume somebody is getting into this intermediate stage here. How do they know that they've surpassed the beginner stage and into intermediate? Do you have any sort of, aside from the metric above that was listed, given your progression rate that we talked about, and that is as an intermediate, or as a beginner you're progressing mostly weekly, and as an intermediate it's monthly or every mesocycle. Do you have any kind of thoughts that you've experienced that you could use to kind of discuss when someone would be an intermediate?
I think it's kind of difficult when it becomes, I would say, like a little bit more important, and it's been that way for a while, maybe 2 years. I think like if 2 years, I feel like if you've been doing it consistently 3 to 5 days per week for 2 years straight, and you've put on a decent amount of weight, let's say 10% or something like that, you're probably safe to say you're in the intermediate stage. If you've progressed across the board, I would say you're probably reaching intermediate stage.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that the commitment level is probably a really big one that I would use just subjectively. um, you've made a commitment to this as a pursuit and something that you want to improve on for sure, and you're willing to kind of make your lifestyle conducive to the furtherment of that goal. Beyond that, I would say you should be able to at least feel the movements that you're doing in the muscle that you're trying to. For the most part, you'll feel some other auxiliary muscles too. um, you may notice some muscle groups progressing faster than other muscle groups. That's something that I think is a telltale sign of, definitely being advanced. Like at that point, you for sure will have imbalances that you're trying to work out. But in intermediate, you might start seeing some signs of that. You've at least put enough muscle on that you'll know whether a muscle is progressing as fast as other muscles are or not. Um, let's see, maybe you need to alter some variables to continue progressing. This is a big one. It kind of plays into the metric that I mentioned above, where beginners are progressing weekly, but when you become intermediate, it might just not be that you just automatically progress monthly. It's like, okay, now I need to tweak this, or I need to work on my frequency, or I need to adjust volume here, or et cetera, et cetera. It requires work for you to continue progressing. And then there's obviously nutrition, which you you kind of went into and covered earlier how it must be conducive to the goal and how being an intermediate does kind of require that to be something important. As you mentioned, the time and stuff like that. And then one other aspect I want to bring up, and I do talk about this a lot, so I don't want to overburden this topic, but the concept of maintenance volume, what you can maintain your current level of muscle mass on for a trained subject is about a third of what they did to gain, right? And I've talked about this. So again, just something to keep in the back of your mind, a good thing to remember if you want to take a week off or if you're just not feeling motivated for a week or an entire mesocycle. Like it doesn't really matter if you drop your volume to a third of what you're doing, you're probably not going to lose anything. So, as you kind of maneuver through these different stages of training and as you work through intermediate and continue there and you're now trained, remember that you can take these kind of back off periods and it doesn't have like a huge impact. Have you what's your deal with time off? I know some people take, they like John Meadows takes 3 weeks off every year in a row, always. I've heard people say every 4 months they take a week off, or every 6 months they take a week off, or et cetera, et cetera. Do you have like planned time off or do you just do deloads? What's your structure?
So in recent years, let's say the last 2 years, my lifestyle will force time off. When we move to a new country or something like that, I don't know where the gym is. I have more important things to figure out, like where we're gonna live, and where I'm eating and getting like my basics in. So that will generally give me at least, generally 2 to 3 weeks, probably cumulative off. Um, Travel, considerations too, if we're heading back to the States or something like that, generally does that for me. Personally, I would say, being completely transparent, let's say I'm not traveling, this is like a fault of mine. I just love training so much. I don't like taking the time away, and I'll try and like sneak in workouts. I'm like, well, it's a day off, but I'm kind of bored. Like maybe I'll just go do shoulders for a little bit or something like that. Like knowing that it's not probably in my best interest, but I just generally enjoy it. So that I will say like is a fault of mine is I'm generally don't. But now that I've in like the last, like, let's say 2 years, I've become very, very diligent with my tracking of my metrics more so than before. And when I can see that things are regressing, it is like okay, Aaron, you are going to be like negligent if you do not deload or something like that. Things are getting worse. You're not even maintaining what you were. This is a clear indication you're overreached, or, a combination of overreach and undercovered. You need to fix this or else it will continue to get worse.
Interesting. Yeah, I feel like one thing I've learned from the last 6 months working with my coach and, having us kind of discuss when it's time for me to deload instead of me just deloading when I want to is I've realized that it's my psychology that mostly requires me to deload more than actual like loss of performance. Then that's the metric that a lot of coaches in the industry use is like when you begin seeing performance either just replicate for a number of weeks or even go backwards a little bit, that's kind of like a sign that okay, we're a little overreached, it's time to deload, let's flush all that fatigue out and build back up. But for me, like I don't generally even reach a point where I begin struggling with matching reps or anything from the prior week. It really is just like a mental thing of I just don't want to go to the gym and train that hard. Like it's not that I don't want to be in the gym because like you, I fucking love the gym. Like I love being there. I love the way it feels. I love practicing movement. Um, but I like think about the night before about the stiff legged deadlift session I need to do or the squats or fucking bench press or whatever it is. And I'm just like, I don't want to do that. Like that sounds really hard. And so it's my psychology that makes me need to deload. And in some ways that maybe makes me weak. But I like to believe that it makes me self-aware. So I think that also kind of plays into the notion of everyone's unique in so many different factors in this endeavor.
The thing that you thought you just brought up was really, really interesting, the psychology of it. And I feel like that is something like when you don't want to go train, um, that's usually an indication, right? So it could be it's time for a deload. A little bit of a side here. If you're deep into a dieting phase or you have been
Mm-hmm.
dieting and your like desire to train has really dropped out, that's like that's a metric of dieting. Like it's like an accumulated fatigue, a stress response, an increase in cortisol type thing. Maybe you're reaching a threshold. That can be an indication there. Or what I find it more recently, especially over this past like year with my leg training, is it depends on the type of training, right? So like I generally don't ever get like anxiety about like an upper body day or whatever. But for example, tomorrow is my third leg session of the week. It is basically just a bunch of supersets and like sets of 15 on the hack squat. It is very mentally demanding. And I know
Yeah.
it's going to be painful, and not like joint painful, but like, okay, I'm on like reps 12, 13, my legs are on fire and I have to keep going. And it's just like my mental, wherewithal that will continue to push me through those reps. So that is like, I'll get not like, I guess like legitimately a little bit of anxiety, like, fuck, that day is tomorrow. Like, I remember how last week was, it was just like a lot of mental anguish. So that is something that comes into play too. And that's something that I would say is more in the like your advanced type part where
Mm-hmm.
you're, you know, it's that mental fortitude pushing you through those extra reps, because physically I know that I can perform it, but everything's on fire. It hurts. I'm breathing really heavy. I'm a sweaty freaking mess. And I have to keep going in order to reach my leg growth goals.
Do I want to dig into this really just a little bit deeper for 1 second? Do you have a minute before we go take the last section of this
Yeah.
podcast? All right, cool. So I'm super curious on your perspective on one aspect of dieting and training. So I would say the evidence based approach is that when you're dieting, your minimum effective volume goes up because you essentially need to your maximum recoverable volume, the amount you can actually do, goes down, but the minimum that you must do goes up because you're trying to retain muscle. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would agree. Especially, well, I agree. I think a big caveat here is, what is your dieting style, right? Let's say you're going keto. It's probably not the best for maximizing the retention of muscle,
Mm-hmm.
because carbohydrates are muscle sparing, right? So I think I agree with that, right? I mean, when you're dieting, you want to fight tooth and nail to keep all of the muscle mass you have. One, because like you built that muscle, of course you want to keep it. And two, you're consistently sending a signal to your body when you're dieting, like, hey, we're in a catabolic state. I need you to eat parts of yourself for an energy substrate, right? I mean, that's literally what it is a controlled starvation where your body eats away at itself. If you want to kind of send the signals to keep parts of that as much as you can, let's say like your muscles, for example, you want to continuously be training them. And then while you're eating like those proteins and amino acids, and the carbohydrate or fuel you do eat goes to like kind of getting those back, or keeping them, I guess. So yeah, I would agree with, as you're dieting, like that minimum effective volume comes up just because other resources that would generally keep the muscle there, for example, like the carbohydrate, they're at a lesser volume.
So I 100% agree with what you're saying, and like it makes so much sense. And yet, alternatively to that belief, I've found both with myself and a number of other people that have been training a number of years in the industry that I've talked about this topic with, that we've found that lower volume seems to be more effective at maintaining strength, almost dropping below what would be like the normal MEV, minimum volume, and maybe going from what would be 10 sets in a week for a muscle group to 6 sets in a week for a muscle group, or 5 sets in a week for a muscle group, but making the effort on each of those higher. And I think with just using conjecture and not scientific data or anything like that, my theory is that this is because when you're dieting, you have such low amounts of usable glycogen that it's difficult to chug through these really long, high volume sessions. And if you have a little bit of glycogen, you have enough, they're not topped off, but there's enough that you can put hard effort in to low volume work. But trying to do moderate volume work or moderate intensity work for longer duration just seems to be really difficult, and ends up leaving me and the people I've talked to almost with like this feeling of cortisol being higher than it should, feeling run down, the whole notion of the CNS fatigue, like all of these different elements that seem to be attenuated when the volume is lower and the intensity ends up going up just a little bit during these dieting phases.
Yeah, I think some of that will be due to your overall duration of the session too, right? And coming back to that, those glycogen stores. And let's say you're not, doing like an intra workout carbohydrate or something like that. You're on a kind of a running clock, and you can expect that you might feel pretty much the same, more or less in like your earlier parts of the workout, but that, you know, last quarter, especially that last like 10%, that's where like you're kind of over it. You're beat. You don't have any more, oomph left to go. So I would definitely agree with that.
Interesting. Yeah, that's just an aside right there that I thought was interesting and hopefully educational for everybody. Um, so kind of wrapping up in the final topic, I guess, of this compound versus isolation topic, I think that as we move into like the intermediate advanced stage and we now have athletes that are adding these isolation movements into their programming, I think there's a really interesting discussion here around which one of compounder isolation is actually the better diagnostic tool for whether we're making progress. Because I think that inherently the natural reaction of people is going to be that if my squat or my bench or my deadlift or these compound movements, if these movements are maintaining strength or they're going up or whatever, then everything's good in the world and I'm getting bigger and stronger, and who cares if my curl goes up and if my tricep push down goes up, because my bench is up and my squat is up and I'm getting yoked. What do you think?
It's hard. It's hard to say, especially because there could be like, what are your limiting factors, right? So it could be you maybe are have like a propensity to injury, right? So in terms of like bench press, let's say you have like shoulder problems. Is adding more compound bench work going to fix your shoulder problems? Probably not, but maybe we're doing adding some like rear delt type stuff or positioning work that can kind of help you fix some of those imbalances, which then in turn down the road allows your bench to go up. I think the farther you move along the spectrum of beginner to advanced, the more um, like the more intricacies are more important, because everyone when you're a beginner, when everyone's a beginner, the path is pretty straightforward. But the farther you get along that spectrum, everyone kind of starts to branch out because imbalances show up, injuries start happening, and these different things that will are very important within their own context to consider.
Yeah, for sure. I think the direction that I want to take this question is in regards to being able to assess growth that may or may not be occurring in a specific muscle group. Um, so when we're looking at a compound movement, and we've alluded to or even mentioned specifically prior in this episode that a bench press is going to work your shoulders and your triceps, that an overhead press is going to also work your triceps, that a pull down is also going to work your biceps, etc. Looking specifically at something like a back squat can be compensated in such a manner that the tension is shifting out of your intended muscle and into an unintended muscle. And therefore, your weights could continue going up without actually growing in the intended muscle. So let's say we want to prioritize our quads and we begin squatting with a knee forward style squat with a torso upright. And as we add weight to the bar week to week, there is just a small shift that occurs very gradually week to week, so that the knee is shifting a teeny bit back, the hips are shifting a teeny bit up, and we're incorporating more and more glute week to week. But we're getting stronger on the back squat, so all's good, right? Or maybe not. That's kind of the issue here, that as we move into this advanced stage, we don't actually really know if a compound movement is targeting the muscles that we hope that it's targeting. So I would argue that for an advanced athlete, that maybe the back squat is not your best diagnostic tool for whether your quads are growing, but rather adding reps and adding weight to your leg extension might be a better testament to whether the quad is actually growing as you intend. If you're bench pressing, same idea. You could be incorporating more tricep, more anterior delt. You could be arching your back a little bit more, using your glutes, pushing through the floor, doing a bit more of this like powerlifting style bench press. So your bench press is going up. You think your chest is growing, when in reality, What we really need to be focusing on is our pec fly or our dumbbell fly or any of these kind of chest abduction movements where something is coming across the chest. Because now, if these movements are going up and we're adding reps and we're adding load, we can be pretty sure that our chest is growing just a little bit. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, this is a perfect way to wrap up. Just because, so really at a the most simplistic level, increase in strength doesn't automatically mean increase in hypertrophy. And that's really what it comes down to. So, because with these compound movements, they're not, I mean, what makes them a compound movement is they're not single joint, right? So, with like your back squat, you have your hips, you have your glutes, you have your hamstrings, your quads, and even like low back. It's not just your legs. And I think, you and I are both, you know, very good examples of people who can increase their squat and their legs just don't grow, which is essentially what landed us, kind of with the training we're doing now, because we realized like after a long time, like, hey, I want bigger legs. I keep squatting more. My squat's going up. My legs aren't getting any bigger. I need to do something else. And same thing with the bench press, right? Especially with like, some of the different, powerlifting techniques and stuff. Like you can bench a lot and get stronger. Doesn't necessarily mean your chest is growing, or it doesn't mean that it's the best way for your chest to grow. And I think that's something that's really, really, once you kind of get into that, advanced trainee standpoint, it's you want to take a hard look at your methodologies and what your goals are, and be honest with yourself and say, hey, do I need to be doing other things? Maybe I need to be using the hack squat, the leg press, where I can remove, my back and hips from the movement, or like, a single leg extent, or sorry, a um, single movement, single joint movement, like a leg extension, where you can remove these things that will kind of overpower the movement so that you can actually train that movement, or that muscle that you want to grow. Really, really good point here.
Yeah, totally. And then wrapping it up, man, like I think it just goes back to the notion of compound movements are going to get you all of the gains that you need until they don't. And you should just keep milking that dry and just hammer those movements, those big movements that give you a big return until they don't work anymore. And then at that point you reassess, you're probably an intermediate, and at that point you can begin instituting some of these more isolated movements and working towards creating that Greek god shape that we're all going for.
Yeah. So let's give everyone a nice little wrap up and try and do like a 30-second wrap up of the episode, like tangible takeaway points. Why don't you start with yours and then I'll add mine?
Yep, totally. So I think, as I just said, beginners milk the compound movements dry. Stick with the 6 to 10 basic compound movements that work multiple muscle groups. Try and hit each muscle group twice a week if you can. There's a number of different ways that we can organize this. This is actually not a wrap up, but I think that it would make sense to put squat on one day, deadlift on one day. You could put bench press on one day and overhead press on one day, and you can put pull up on one day and row on one day. So you've essentially got 2 full body training days. Each one has a leg dominant movement and a push and a pull. So I think that'd be a really cool way to organize your training. You could do those every other day and just alternate those sessions, basically hitting them 3 times a week, and you'd be getting more than enough stimulus that you need as a beginner. Ride that wave till that wave stops producing results. If you're a beginner and you're listening to this, that's fucking awesome, because I don't know too many beginners that are. But if you are listening to this and you have friends that are beginners and they need a direction to take their training, I think this is a really good episode for them to get in their ears. And that's pretty much all I got, man. Pretty quick wrap up there.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you nailed that really good. The last kind of things I will add on top of it is it's never too early to start paying attention to your nutrition and your sleep in efforts of hypertrophy. You literally grow at night when you're sleeping, and your nutrition fuels and facilitates a very large percentage of that recovery, and the basic amino acids building blocks of what your muscles are made out of. So kind of that little cherry on top. And yeah, really, really good episode for people who are earlier on, and what really the basics are, why they're the basics, and milking them as long as you can, and not only adding complexity when you need to.
Love it. Well said.
Awesome. So thanks for listening in, guys. We will talk to you next time. Thank you so much for listening to Eat, Train, Prosper. If you found this episode valuable, please subscribe or share us with your friends. You can find more from Aaron at strakernutritionco.com and more from Brian at evolvedtrainingsystems.com. Talk to you guys next time.